this game? Well, fortunately, we can use decision theory to help figure this out. It turns out that you're going to be winning a lot of money every time you win, and you're not going to be losing as much money every time you lose. But it also is true that you're not going to win that often. You're only going to win 1 out of every 6 times, right? You'll win every time there's a 6, but you'll lose every time there's a 1, or you roll a 2, or you roll a 3, or you roll a 4, or you roll a 5. So that's 5 out of 6 times you're going to average losing. So we have to figure out now, does the benefit of winning, given you don't win that often, outweigh the negatives of losing when you're going to lose a lot? Or do the negatives of losing outweigh the benefits of winning? What's the average result? And there's a little bit of formula you can plug it in. You just multiply the probability times the expected gain. So you multiply 24 times 1/6, and you add that to -6 times 5/6, which is the amount that you're expected to lose every time you lose, times the probability you're expected to lose, 5 out of every 6 times. And you add that together, and that should tell you the average result, whether you're going to be net winning money every time you play, or on average losing money every time you play. And if you do the math here, 1/6 times 24 is $4. 5/6 times -6 is -$5. So that's 4 plus -5 equals -1. And that means your average result is a loss. On average, you are going to be losing every time you play this game. So what that means is that it is in your interest to not play this game. The reason why is because when you don't play, you neither win money or lose money. Your average outcome when you don't play is neither winning nor losing, just going even, losing no money at all. Obviously not winning any, but not losing any. And not losing any money at all is better than losing $1 every time you play. So this is a particular game that you should not play. And just as a side point, I'd like to point out that nearly every game in the casino is rigged in this type of way. A smarter person than I said that the best way to beat the casino is to never enter the casino in the first place. That's really the only way to guarantee that you are not going to lose any money to a casino. And that seems to make sense because every single game is designed for you to lose money on average. The more you play, the more you're guaranteed to lose eventually in the long run. All right, so this is the type of reasoning that Pascal uses. This type of chart that's in front of us right now is a decision theory chart. You have various options in front of you. Our left-hand column says your options are either you play the game or you don't play the game. And then you have the various outcomes. There are going to be different outcomes based off whether you win or whether you lose. And then you have the various probabilities that you're going to win and the probabilities that you're going to lose. And you do a little bit of math to figure out whether, on average, it's in your interest to play or not to play. On average, what your outcome is going to be. And then you just compare that average to each other. And whichever has the better outcome in your interest is which decision you should choose. This is why it's called decision theory. It helps you decide which option you should take. So this type of cost-benefit analysis, this type of decision theory, can apply to believing in God, because there are expected gains and expected losses when it comes to believing in God. What are those expected gains and expected losses? Well, let's create a little bit of a decision chart now. Our options here are we either believe in God or we don't believe in God. And the possible outcomes is that there really is a God in reality, or there's no God exists. So let's try to fill in each one of our squares in our charts. Our first square is if you believe in God and there actually is a God, the best possible outcome there is that we get to go to an afterlife that's awfully happy and eternal, this perfect paradise where you live forever in bliss. It's heaven. And that is a really, really awesome reward. Pascal says that's like plus infinity as far as happiness points goes. Kind of making up an idea of happiness points. But there's really no better reward possible than getting to live forever in a perfect paradise in the afterlife. That's the absolute awesomest, plus infinity. Now what happens, let's move squares, if you believe that there's a God and there is no God? Well, for most people, I don't know, that might not be that big a deal, right? But worst case scenario, you might feel like you were a bit of a sucker, right? You wasted so much time being religious. Maybe you wasted all that time praying to a God that didn't exist, thinking you had this relationship with a God that didn't exist. You probably wasted a lot of your freedom. You could have been doing all this other stuff. You could have been leading an independent, autonomous life. Instead, you sacrificed a lot to follow these rules that you might not have had to have followed anyway. But all of this amounts to some finite loss, because you only, existed for 70, 80, 90, 100 years. And none of that really amounts to as bad a thing as heaven is good. So if we're dealing with happy points, I don't know, I'm kind of putting an arbitrary number here. Let's say that's like negative 100 happy points. That's a lot, but it's not as bad as heaven is good. All right? So following that up, now let's go to the option where you don't believe. What happens when you don't believe? Well, if you don't believe and there actually is a God, lots of religions say, you go to the wrong afterlife. In that case, you go to hell. And that's really bad, right? Because that's an eternity of torture and torment and weeping and gnashing of teeth where you can never escape that. And so that's like just the opposite of hell. That's negative infinity. That's the worst possible thing that could ever happen to you and will continue happening for the rest of your life without end. That's pretty bad. Now, what happens if you don't believe and there's no God? Well, in this case, you bet and you won, because you got to enjoy all of your life. You didn't waste any time by praying or going to church or being religious or whatever. You got to enjoy all those things, all those times. You didn't have to sacrifice anything for a false reason. You got to enjoy all your freedoms, be an autonomous person who lived the exact type of life you wanted to. But again, that's only a finite gain, because that only deals with a finite amount of time, 70 years, 80 years, 90 years, 100 years of your life. So that's like, let's say, plus 100. Again, just comparing it to the negative 100 and that square above it. Well, let's do our math here and add these together. When in the believe row, we've got the possibility of there being a God, leaving us with the possibility of plus infinity, and the possibility of there no God, leaving us with the negative 100. Well, what's infinity minus 100? Well, one principle when we're dealing with infinity minus any finite number is always going to be infinity. So no matter what it is, once you've dealt with infinity, you're left with infinity. So our average outcome, if we believe, is a net reward of infinity happy points. That's awesome. And the same's going to apply, but in reverse, to the don't believe row. If you don't believe in God and there is a God, that gives you negative infinity and hell. If you don't believe in God and there isn't a God, that gives you 100 happy points. But negative infinity plus 100 equals negative infinity, because negative infinity plus any finite number is still negative infinity. So the don't believe column leaves you with a negative happiness of the worst possible outcome there is. Well, now, one thing I did was oversimplify a little bit, because I kind of forgot to weigh the probabilities, right? What's the probability that there actually is a God? What's the probability that there's no God? Well, according to Pascal, the philosopher who's arguing this, Pascal says, we don't know what the odds are. We don't know. Reason can tell us nothing. There's an infinite gap which separates us from God, or the knowledge of God, or lack thereof.